They called me the family disappointment for as long as I can remember. But that freezing Thanksgiving night, as I sat at the edge of my parents' perfectly staged dining table, watching my brother-in-law peddle his absolute lies to my vulnerable relatives, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't a screaming match or a dramatic exit. Sometimes, true justice is just sitting back quietly, armed with the truth, and letting arrogant people dig their own graves. My name is Izolda Corbett, and I am 32 years old. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. I work as a forensic accountant. While other accountants balance ledgers and file taxes, my job is to follow the money when things go wrong. I hunt down hidden assets, dismantle complex corporate frauds, and expose financial discrepancies for a living. I am very good at recognizing a bad investment, but apparently, my career choice was just another source of profound embarrassment for my mother. It was Thanksgiving at my parents' house, a sprawling, cookie-cutter suburban home that smelled heavily of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and the overpowering scent of my mother's expensive Chanel perfume. My parents, Dorian and Selma, had spent their entire lives obsessed with appearances. They weren't wealthy. My father managed a mid-level regional hardware supply chain, and my mother was a homemaker whose full-time job was dominating the local country club's social committee. Yet, they lived in a constant, exhausting state of trying to prove they belonged to the upper crust. The dining room was set like a magazine cover. Crystal wine glasses, polished silver cutlery, and a massive centerpiece of imported autumn florals that I knew for a fact my mother had put on a credit card she couldn't afford to pay off. I sat near the corner of the table, holding the hand of the only person in the room who actually loved me for who I was, my partner, Elias Thorne. Elias was 35, a structural engineer with calloused hands, kind eyes, and a quiet, immovable strength. He didn't wear custom Italian suits or brag about his income. He built bridges, literally, and he had spent the last 5 years building a safe harbor for me, far away from the toxic storm of my family. We were all waiting for the guest of honor, the golden child. The heavy mahogany front door finally swung open, nearly 45 minutes late. My younger sister, Narina, swept into the foyer, bringing a gust of cold November air and an overwhelming aura of performative exhaustion. Narina was 29, effortlessly beautiful, and had never held a real job for more than 6 months. When we were kids, I wore frayed hand-me-downs from older cousins so that my parents could afford Narina's elite private ballet lessons and vocal coaches. She was the star. I was the stagehand. Trailing right behind her was her husband, Julian Vance. Julian was 33, slick, loud, and chronically overconfident. He wore a tailored navy blazer, aggressively shiny leather loafers, and a smile that always struck me as deeply predatory. Julian claimed to be the founder and managing director of an exclusive private equity firm. According to my parents, he was a financial genius, a self-made millionaire who was destined to elevate the Corbett family name into high society. "So sorry we're late," Narina gushed, kissing the air next to my mother's cheek so as not to ruin her flawless makeup. Julian was on a conference call with his investors in Tokyo. You know how the Asian markets are, they just never sleep. "Oh, my darling, don't you worry at all," my mother Selma cooed, her face lighting up with a genuine adoration she had never, not once, directed at me. "Julian works so hard to provide for you. Come, sit down. The turkey is perfectly warm." My father, Dorian, immediately stood up, his chest puffed out with pride. He walked over and firmly shook Julian's hand, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good to see you, son. Market treating you well?" "Always, Dorian. Always," Julian replied, shooting his cuffs to make absolutely sure the massive, sparkling Rolex on his left wrist caught the light from the dining room chandelier. "Just closed a massive commercial real estate bundle. 7 figures. It's been a crazy quarter, but we're pushing forward." Elias squeezed my hand under the table. I didn't roll my eyes, but it took every ounce of my professional self-control to maintain a neutral expression. I looked at the Rolex. It was a day-date model, ostentatious and loud. We all settled around the table. The extended family was there too. Aunt Susan, a retired schoolteacher, and Uncle David, a retired mechanic who had spent 40 years breaking his back in a garage to build a modest nest egg. As my mother passed the mashed potatoes, she decided it was time to establish the family hierarchy, as she did at every holiday gathering. She looked across the table at me, her smile tight and purely performative. "So, Izolda, are you still working at that dreary little accounting firm, sorting through people's boring tax receipts?" The table went slightly quiet. Aunt Susan looked down at her plate. "I'm a forensic accountant, Mom. I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I work for a corporate investigative firm. I don't do taxes. I investigate fraud. Selma let out a high-pitched, dismissive laugh, waving her hand as if swatting away a fly. Oh, fraud, taxes, it's all the same thing. You sit in a cubicle and stare at spreadsheets all day. It's just such a shame you didn't inherit your sister's creative spark, but I suppose someone has to do the tedious, invisible work. Her work is actually incredibly vital, Elias spoke up, his deep voice carrying a firm, protective edge that immediately made my father stiffen. Isolde just helped the federal authorities trace a multi-million-dollar embezzlement ring. She's brilliant at what she does. Selma's smile didn't reach her cold eyes. She hated Elias. She hated him because she couldn't manipulate him, and she hated him because he didn't bow down to the illusion of the Corbett family's superiority. Well, Julian interjected, leaning back in his chair and swirling his red wine. He looked at me with an expression of profound, unearned pity. There's a ceiling to that kind of W-2 grind, Elias. Working for a paycheck is safe, sure, but if you want real wealth, generational wealth, you have to make your money work for you. You have to understand leverage. You have to play in the private equity space. Exactly, Narina chimed in, adjusting the heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. Julian is trying to tell you guys, you're never going to get rich working 9 to 5. You have to take risks. I mean, look at us. Julian's fund is returning 20% this year. My ears pricked up. 20%. I set my fork down slowly. As a financial investigator, I know that anyone promising a consistent 20% return in modern markets is either a statistical anomaly on par with Warren Buffett, or they are lying through their teeth. 20% is an impressive margin, Julian, I said casually, taking a sip of my water. What's the primary vehicle for your fund? Are you mostly in venture capital or leveraged buyouts? Julian's confident smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. It was a micro-expression, a tiny twitch of the eye that most people would miss. But in my line of work, that twitch is a screaming siren. We use a diversified algorithmic strategy, Julian said, throwing out a word salad of financial buzzwords. A proprietary mix of high-frequency trading, distressed debt, and offshore real estate trusts. It's highly complex, institutional-level stuff. Not something you'd see in standard corporate auditing. He took a quick, nervous sip of his wine, clearly eager to change the subject. But my father, ever the enabler, was practically glowing with pride. Dorian leaned across the table, his eyes shining with greedy excitement. Julian is a visionary, Isolde. You should really listen to him, Dorian scolded me. In fact, Julian has been kind enough to open up a secondary friends and family portfolio. He's doing us a massive favor. My stomach dropped. The mashed potatoes suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked over at Aunt Susan and Uncle David. They were leaning forward, hanging onto every single word Julian said. It's true, Julian said, shifting his focus away from me and directing his aggressive charisma toward my aging aunt and uncle. Usually, my fund requires a minimum buy-in of $500,000, only accredited investors. But because family is everything to me, I've set up a sidecar LLC. I'm waiving the management fees for you guys. If you roll your retirement IRAs over into my management, I can guarantee a fixed 15% annual yield, completely risk-free. Guarantee, fixed yield, risk-free. In the world of private equity, those words are not just red flags, they are illegal. The Securities and Exchange Commission explicitly prohibits investment advisors from promising guaranteed returns on market-based investments. It is the absolute hallmark of a Ponzi scheme. Julian, Uncle David said, his voice trembling slightly with awe. 15%? Are you sure? The bank only gives us a fraction of a percent on our savings. We have our entire life savings, about $300,000, sitting in a low-yield mutual fund. We were terrified about inflation eating it away. David, don't be a fool, Selma snapped at her brother, though her tone was sickeningly sweet. Julian is offering you a golden ticket. Dorian and I already moved all of our liquid assets into Julian's fund last month. The monthly dividend checks have been staggering. He is going to make sure we can retire in luxury. I felt the blood drain from my face. My parents had given this man their money, and now my mother was actively pressuring her own brother to hand over his life savings. I looked at Narina. She was smiling blissfully, completely absorbed in her own reflection in the dining room mirror, adjusting her hair. She had no idea how the financial world worked. She only cared that the credit cards kept clearing at the designer boutiques. Julian, I spoke up, my voice cutting through the enthusiastic chatter of the table. If you're managing external capital, especially retirement funds, you must be a registered investment advisor. Which regulatory body holds your Series 7 and Series 65 licenses? FINRA or the SEC? The entire table fell dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Julian's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. He glared at me, the friendly facade completely dropping to reveal something venomous underneath. I operate through a private syndicate exemption, Isolde. Like I said, it's complex. We use a prime brokerage that handles all the back office compliance. You wouldn't understand the legal structure. I investigate complex legal structures every single day, I replied, not breaking eye contact. Even under an exemption, you still have to file a Form D with the SEC to legally solicit capital. Have you filed a Form D? Isolde, that is enough. My mother slammed her hand down on the mahogany table, making the crystal wine glasses shake. Her eyes were blazing with absolute fury. How dare you? How dare you come into my home on Thanksgiving and interrogate your brother-in-law like he's some common criminal? Mom, I'm just asking basic. You are being jealous and vindictive, Selma shrieked, her voice rising to that hysterical, victimized pitch she always used when she was losing control of a narrative. You cannot stand it, can you? You cannot stand that Nerina married a successful, wealthy man while you are stuck in a dead-end job with a construction worker. She sneered the words, pointing a shaking finger at Elias. Elias didn't flinch. He just calmly placed his hand over mine, grounding me. Your sister is trying to build a beautiful life. My father, Dorian, chimed in, his face tight with disappointment. Julian is offering to help this entire family. He is offering to protect Aunt Susan and Uncle David's future. And you're sitting there, throwing around legal jargon just to sound smart and humiliate him. You owe Julian an apology. I looked around the table. Aunt Susan and Uncle David were staring at me like I had just ruined their chance at winning the lottery. Nerina was pouting, playing the victim, tears welling up in her eyes as Julian protectively wrapped an arm around her shoulders. And my parents looked at me with a level of disgust that cut straight to my core. For 32 years, I had craved their approval. I had worked twice as hard, studied late into the night, paid my own way through college, and built a respectable, honest career, all in the desperate, pathetic hope that one day my mother would look at me the way she looked at Nerina. But sitting there, watching them blindly defend a man who was actively lying to them, the desperate little girl inside me finally went quiet. The longing for a mother's love was suddenly replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of a forensic investigator. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I'm sorry, I said, offering Julian a thin, empty smile. You're right. Private equity isn't my specialty. I shouldn't have overstepped. Julian visibly relaxed, puffing his chest back out, victorious. It's fine, Isolde. We can't all be financial experts. I'll send you some basic reading material on algorithmic trading next week. Maybe you can learn a thing or two. I'd appreciate that, I replied softly. The tension at the table slowly dissipated. My mother went back to pouring wine, and Julian smoothly resumed his pitch to my vulnerable aunt and uncle, promising them the moon and the stars if they just signed over their retirement accounts to him on Monday morning. Elias looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I squeezed his hand back. He knew me well enough to know that my apology was not a surrender. It was a tactical retreat. I wasn't going to cause a scene and scream about SEC violations over pumpkin pie. Julian had too much influence over them right now. If I pushed back, I would just be painted as the bitter, jealous sister, and Uncle David would hand over his money just to spite me. If I wanted to protect my extended family, and if I wanted to expose the golden boy for what he truly was, I couldn't rely on basic questions. I needed hard, undeniable proof. I needed the paper trail. Julian Vance had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had invited a senior forensic accountant to look into his finances. The Thanksgiving dinner dragged on for another agonizing 2 hours. When Elias and I finally walked out to our car, the freezing night air felt like a massive relief. As Elias started the engine, the heater roaring to life, he looked over at me in the dim light of the dashboard. He's running a scam, isn't he? I pulled my seatbelt across my chest and stared out the window at my parents' perfectly manicured lawn. He used the term fixed yield for an equity fund. He doesn't have a Series 7 license. And that Rolex he was flashing all night? What about it? Elias asked, putting the car into gear. The sweeping motion of the second hand was stuttering. I said quietly, It's a fake. A good fake, but a fake. Elias let out a low whistle, shaking his head. So what are you going to do? I pulled out my phone, opening up the browser to the public database of the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. I'm going to do my job, I whispered. I'm going to follow the money. The Monday after Thanksgiving, the corporate investigative firm I worked for was buzzing with the usual end-of-the-month chaos. My desk was buried under stacks of subpoenaed bank records from a messy corporate divorce case. I spent the entire morning tracing $3 million that a pharmaceutical executive had tried to hide from his wife by funneling it through a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. To the untrained eye, the financial records looked like an impenetrable wall of numbers. But to me, numbers are a language. They tell a story. They reveal where a person has been, what they value, and most importantly, what they are desperately trying to hide. People lie, cry, and deflect, but bank statements are remarkably, ruthlessly honest. Around 2 p.m, my cell phone buzzed on my desk. The caller ID flashed a name I rarely saw outside of obligatory holiday texts. Julian Vance. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow sip of my black coffee before I picked up. Isolde! Julian's voice boomed through the speaker, radiating that aggressive, artificial warmth of a salesman who is about to ask you for a favor. How's my favorite sister-in-law doing this beautiful Monday? I'm at work, Julian, I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, a blank slate. What can I do for you? Right, the 9 to 5 grind. Listen, I was thinking about our little chat at the dinner table on Thursday, he said, lowering his voice slightly, adopting a tone of conspiratorial intimacy. I know things got a little tense with your mom, and I just wanted to clear the air. I don't want any bad blood between us. Family is family, right? Sure, Julian. Water under the bridge. Exactly. And look, I totally understand why you were asking all those questions about SEC compliance and regulatory filings. You're an accountant. You're trained to be cautious. But I also know that caution keeps people poor, Isolde. He paused, letting the insult hang in the air disguised as friendly advice. I know you and Elias are working hard, but let's be real. Living on 2 W-2 salaries in this economy, you're basically just treading water. You're never going to get ahead. You're never going to have the kind of life Narina and I have. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to the bridge of my nose. The sheer audacity of the man was staggering. He was calling me at my fraud investigation job to tell me I was poor. And what kind of life is that, Julian? I asked softly. Freedom, Isolde. Absolute financial freedom, he boasted. And because I actually do care about you guys, despite what your mother thinks, I'm willing to do you a massive favor. I have 1 slot left in my secondary family and friends portfolio. Aunt Susan and Uncle David are already wiring their funds this afternoon. If you and Elias can scrape together 50 grand, maybe pull a home equity line of credit or empty your 401ks, I can get you in. I'm waiving the management fees. I will personally guarantee you a 12% return by the end of Q1. And he was actively trying to hustle me. He had successfully manipulated my vulnerable aunt and uncle, and now, emboldened by his own arrogance, he thought he could reel me in too. He assumed my professional questions at Thanksgiving were just a bluff, a desperate attempt to sound smart. He didn't actually believe I knew what I was talking about. Narcissists always underestimate the quiet ones in the room. $50,000 is a lot of liquid capital for us, Julian, I said, injecting just enough hesitation into my voice to sound tempted. Elias and I would have to talk about it, but before we even consider moving our retirement funds, I would need to see the paperwork. You know how I am. I need to read the fine print. Julian let out a loud, patronizing chuckle. Of course you do. Always the auditor. I'll do you one better. I'll email you the official prospectus and the private placement memorandum right now. Look it over. Show it to Elias. But don't take too long, Isolde. This train is leaving the station, and I'd hate for you to be left standing on the platform. Send it over, I said. I'll read every single word. Check your inbox in 5 minutes, he replied smugly and hung up. Exactly 4 minutes later, an email chimed in my inbox. The subject line read, Vance Capital Partners, Confidential Offering Memorandum. Attached was a heavy 50-page PDF document. I didn't open it immediately. I forwarded the email to my encrypted personal home server, packed up my briefcase, and left the office right at 5 o'clock. This wasn't corporate business. This was personal. That evening, the winter rain was lashing against the windows of the modest 2-bedroom craftsman home Elias and I had spent the last 3 years renovating. The fireplace was crackling, casting a warm orange glow across the living room. Elias walked in from the kitchen, wearing a faded gray t-shirt and sweatpants, carrying 2 steaming mugs of Earl Grey tea. He set a mug down next to my laptop on the dining table and leaned over my shoulder, resting his heavy chin against my hair. "Is that the Golden Boys master plan?" Elias asked, his eyes scanning the glossy title page of the PDF glowing on my screen. "This is the bait he's using to drain Aunt Susan's retirement account," I murmured, taking a sip of the hot tea. Let's see exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes. I opened the prospectus. At first glance, it was a masterpiece of corporate illusion. The document was visually stunning, filled with high-resolution stock photos of gleaming glass skyscrapers, diverse groups of executives shaking hands in ultra-modern boardrooms, and upward-trending line graphs soaring in vibrant shades of blue and gold. The language was dense, intimidating, and packed with complex financial jargon designed to overwhelm a layman. It spoke of algorithmic arbitrage, collateralized debt optimization, and proprietary macroeconomic hedging. And to my father, a man who sold hardware supplies, or my Aunt Susan, a retired middle school teacher, this document looked like pure, unadulterated Wall Street genius. It looked like wealth. But I am not a layman. I scrolled past the glossy photos and the aggressive marketing copy, diving straight into the mathematical modeling and the risk disclosure matrices. Within 10 minutes, the illusion began to violently unravel. "Look at this," I said, pointing my pen at a chart on page 18. Elias pulled up a chair and sat next to me, his brow furrowed. He claims his fund utilizes a high-frequency trading algorithm to capitalize on micro-fluctuations in foreign currency markets. But look at his historical return data. He's claiming a perfectly smooth upward trajectory of 15% month over month with zero drawdown. "What does that mean in English?" Elias asked, leaning closer. "It means it's statistically impossible," I explained, the cold thrill of the hunt setting into my veins. Even the most aggressive, sophisticated hedge funds in the world, funds backed by supercomputers and MIT astrophysicists, have negative months. The market goes up, the market goes down, but Julian's graph never dips. It's a perfectly straight line drawn by someone who doesn't understand how actual trading volatility works. It's a fantasy. It's Bernie Madoff's exact mathematical fingerprint. Elias exhaled sharply. "Okay, but bad math isn't necessarily a crime. Maybe he's just exaggerating his past performance to get you to invest." "Exaggerating past performance on an official offering memorandum is wire fraud," I corrected him, "but let's look at the regulatory compliance." I opened a new tab on my browser and navigated to the SEC's EDGAR database, the Electronic Data Gathering, Analysis, and Retrieval System. By law, any entity raising capital from private investors in the United States must file specific registration forms or claim a legal exemption. I typed Vance Capital Partners into the search bar. No matching companies found. I tried Vance Private Equity. No matching companies found. I went to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, BrokerCheck website, and typed in Julian Vance's full legal name to see if he held any active trading licenses. The screen loaded instantly. No results found for Julian Vance. He was a ghost. He wasn't a registered investment advisor. His firm didn't legally exist in the eyes of the federal government. He was illegally soliciting hundreds of thousands of dollars from unaccredited investors without a single shred of regulatory oversight. "He's not registered," I whispered, the sheer magnitude of his audacity washing over me. "He has no license to trade securities. He has no legal authority to manage Aunt Susan's retirement." Elias's jaw tightened. "Where the hell is the money going, Isolde? If he's not trading it, where is it?" "Let's find out where he actually works." I scrolled down to the very last page of the prospectus, the contact sheet. The address was listed in bold, elegant typography. Vance Capital Partners, Suite 400, 1500 Financial Plaza, downtown. It sounded incredibly prestigious. I pulled up the state's Secretary of State Corporate Registry and ran a search for the LLC. The company was registered, but it wasn't registered as a financial institution. It was registered as a general consulting firm. And the registered agent, the person legally responsible for receiving tax and legal documents, wasn't a high-powered law firm. It was LegalZoom, a cheap, automated online service you use to set up a business for $200. "Look at the physical address," I told Elias, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I opened Google Maps. I typed in the address listed on the glossy prospectus, 1500 Financial Plaza. The satellite image zoomed in, shifting into street view. Elias let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. The address wasn't a gleaming glass skyscraper in the financial district. It was a run-down, single-story strip mall on the outskirts of the city. Nestled between a heavily barred pawn shop and a discount liquor store with flickering neon signs was a small, dingy storefront with a blue awning. The sign above the door read, "The UPS Store." Suite 400 isn't an office suite, I said, a cold, dark dread settling heavily in my stomach. It's P.O. Box number 400. He doesn't have an office, Elias. He doesn't have a trading floor. He doesn't have staff. The silence in our living room was deafening. The only sound was the rain lashing against the glass and the steady hum of my laptop's cooling fan. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Julian wasn't a financial genius. He was running an incredibly basic, incredibly destructive Ponzi scheme. Oh my God, Elias breathed, rubbing his face with both hands. Narina's diamond tennis bracelet, that custom Rolex he was flashing at the dinner table, the leased BMW they drove to your parents' house. It's Aunt Susan's money, I finished for him, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound heartbreak and absolute white-hot rage. He's paying my parents dividends with Aunt Susan's principal investment. He's using Uncle David's retirement savings to fund Narina's shopping sprees at Neiman Marcus. There is no algorithm. There is no offshore real estate. There is just a single, massive checking account, and he's draining it to play pretend. Elias stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He paced across the living room, his hands running through his dark hair. The protective anger radiated off him in waves. "Call the police at Isolda," Elias commanded, his voice sharp and urgent. "Call the FBI field office right now. We have the fake prospectus. We have the proof that he's unlicensed. We have to stop him before he gets his hands on the rest of your aunt's money." I stared at the Google Maps image of the dingy UPS store. My heart was pounding frantically against my ribs, screaming at me to pick up the phone and burn Julian Vance to the ground. It would be so easy. One phone call and the authorities would be knocking on his door. But my forensic training overrode my emotional panic. "I can't," I said quietly, closing the laptop screen. Elias stopped pacing and stared at me, bewildered. "What do you mean you can't? Isolde, he is stealing your family's life savings right now. Your parents are broke. They mortgaged their entire future on this guy. And if I call the FBI right now, what do you think will happen?" I asked, looking up at him, forcing my voice to remain calm, analytical. "The feds will open an inquiry. They'll send Julian a subpoena for his records. The absolute second that subpoena hits his P.O. box, Julian will panic. He will log into his shell accounts, wire every single remaining dollar to an untraceable offshore crypto wallet in a non-extradition country, and he will disappear." Elias swallowed hard, the reality of the situation dawning on him. "White-collar criminals don't fight when they're cornered, Elias," I explained, standing up and walking over to him. "They run, and they take the money with them. If I blow the whistle now, before I know exactly where the money is being stored, Aunt Susan loses everything forever. The government might put Julian in prison in 5 years, but they rarely recover the stolen funds. I need the routing numbers. I need the names of the banks holding the shell accounts." Elias wrapped his arms around me, pulling me against his chest. I rested my forehead against his shoulder, listening to the steady, calming beat of his heart. For 32 years, my family had treated me like a burden. They had belittled my career and worshipped the ground my sister walked on. They had literally laughed in my face when I tried to warn them. Part of me, the wounded, rejected child, wanted to sit back and let them burn. I wanted to let my mother lose everything she held dear just so she could finally experience the consequences of her own blinding, arrogant vanity. But I thought about Aunt Susan, who had slipped me a $20 bill every Christmas when my parents refused to buy me presents. I thought about Uncle David, whose hands were permanently scarred from a lifetime of honest, grueling labor. I couldn't let them be destroyed just to teach my parents a lesson. "So, what's the play?" Elias asked softly, resting his chin on the top of my head. "How do you get his bank records without spooking him?" I stepped back, looking up at Alice, a cold, calculated strategy already forming in my mind. "Julian thrives on ego," I said, walking back to the table and picking up my cold mug of tea. "He thinks I'm a bitter, jealous sister who is desperate for cash. He wants to prove he's better than me. I'm going to give him exactly what he wants." "You're going to invest?" Elias asked, his eyebrows shooting up. "No, I smiled, a tight, dangerous expression. I'm going to tell him I want to invest, but I'm going to tell him that my bank's compliance department requires a micro deposit verification from his receiving institution to clear a $50,000 wire transfer. In order to process the fake transfer, he has to give me his primary account and routing numbers. Once I have those, you run a backdoor trace on the accounts, Elias finished, a slow grin spreading across his face. Exactly. I follow the money. I document every single stolen dollar, every single luxury purchase he made with Aunt Susan's retirement fund. I build a forensic dossier so bulletproof that when I finally hand it over to the IRS and the FBI, Julian won't just be investigated. He will be executed by the federal justice system. I opened my laptop back up and drafted a highly deferential, perfectly submissive email to Julian Vance. I apologized for my behavior at Thanksgiving. I told him Elias and I were desperate for financial freedom. I begged him to let us into his exclusive fund, asking for his wire transfer instructions. I hit send. The trap was set. But as I sat in the quiet of my living room, watching the rain wash down the windows, I had absolutely no idea that the rabbit hole was infinitely darker than a simple Ponzi scheme. I thought Julian was the sole architect of this disaster. I thought my parents were just his tragic, foolish victims. I was wrong. The true betrayal hadn't even begun to surface, and when it finally did, it would shatter the Corbett family into a million unrecoverable pieces. 2 days after I sent that submissive, groveling email to Julian, my inbox chimed. I was sitting at my kitchen island, the cold December morning light filtering through the blinds. Elias was at work, leaving the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I opened the email. Julian hadn't just sent me the wire instructions. He had sent me a masterpiece of condescension. He congratulated me on finally waking up and taking control of my financial destiny. He assured me that while $50,000 was pocket change for his usual investors, he was happy to let me ride his coattails. Attached at the very bottom, right below his ridiculously oversized embossed email signature, were the exact details I had been hunting for. A routing number and an account number for a commercial checking account at a mid-sized regional bank. I stared at the numbers on the screen, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. Julian thought he had just closed a deal. He had no idea he had just handed the keys to his entire fraudulent kingdom directly to a senior forensic investigator. Within an hour, using the specialized skip tracing software I utilize for corporate espionage and divorce asset recovery, I fed the account numbers into the system. It would take time for the software to aggregate the transactions, bypass the shell company layers, and build a comprehensive map of the incoming and outgoing cash flow. I needed a few weeks to build a file so dense and irrefutable that a federal prosecutor wouldn't have to do a single ounce of actual work to indict him. But while the software quietly chewed through Julian's financial life, the real world demanded my presence. It was mid-December, which meant it was time for my mother's annual birthday extravaganza. Selma Corbett was turning 58, an event she treated with the gravity and pageantry of a royal coronation. For the past decade, she had hosted her parties at the Oak Ridge Country Club, an exclusive, hyper-pretentious establishment where the initiation fees alone cost more than my first car. My parents couldn't actually afford their membership. They were drowning in credit card debt just to keep up appearances. But to my mother, the club was her entire identity. Elias and I drove up the winding, manicured driveway of the club on a freezing Saturday evening. The massive Tudor-style clubhouse was dripping in tasteful, expensive white Christmas lights. Valets in crisp uniforms were rushing to park a steady stream of Mercedes, Lexuses, and Range Rovers. Elias handed the keys of our modest 5-year-old sedan to the valet, wrapping a warm arm around my waist as we walked up the stone steps. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly, his breath pluming in the icy air. "I'm treating it as a covert operation," I whispered back, adjusting the collar of my dark emerald evening dress. We smile, we eat the overpriced salmon, and we keep Julian completely convinced that we are liquidating our retirement accounts to invest with him. If we spook him now, the money disappears. We stepped through the heavy oak doors and into the grand ballroom. The air was suffocatingly thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements, roasted meats, and the underlying metallic tang of pure, unadulterated snobbery. My mother was holding court in the center of the room. She was wearing a floor-length silver gown that was entirely inappropriate for a standard birthday dinner, holding a flute of champagne and laughing loudly at something a wealthy local plastic surgeon had just said. Beside her, radiating pure, arrogant entitlement, stood Narina and Julian. Narina was dripping in what looked like brand new sapphire jewelry, and Julian was wearing a velvet dinner jacket, looking every inch the Wall Street tycoon he was pretending to be. When my mother spotted us walking across the ballroom, her artificial glowing smile instantly tightened into a thin, critical line. She excused herself from her wealthy friends and marched directly toward us, Narina and Julian trailing right behind her like loyal lapdogs. "Isolde," Selma said, her eyes immediately sweeping over my dress, assessing its value and finding it lacking. "You made it. I was beginning to wonder if you and Elias were going to show up at all. It's not like you to attend events where you actually have to dress up." "Happy birthday, Mom," I said smoothly, handing her a beautifully wrapped gift box containing an expensive silk scarf she would likely never wear. "The club looks beautiful tonight." "Julian arranged for the premium catering package," my mother boasted, her voice intentionally loud enough for the passing waitstaff and nearby guests to hear. "He insisted on treating me for my birthday. Truly, I am the luckiest mother in the world to have a son-in-law who actually knows how to spoil his family." Julian offered a modest, completely fake shrug, slipping his hands into his velvet pockets. "Nothing is too good for you, Selma. Besides, the fund had a record-breaking week. We have a lot to celebrate." Narina looped her arm through Julian's, looking at me with a mixture of pity and smug superiority. "Julian has just been so stressed lately, Isolde. Managing all these millions, dealing with international clients. It's exhausting, but he still makes time for family. Speaking of which, did you guys finally get your act together? Julian said you were begging to get into the friends and family portfolio." The word begging hung in the air, acidic and sharp. "We're finalizing the paperwork with our bank, Narina," I replied, my voice perfectly calm. "Moving $50,000 takes a few days of compliance checks. We just want to make sure everything is in order." My mother let out an impatient, dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes toward the crystal chandelier above us. "Compliance checks. Always with the excuses, Isolde," Selma scolded, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive venom. She took a sip of her champagne and leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a harsh, scolding whisper. "Aunt Susan and Uncle David wired their money 3 days after Thanksgiving. The Harringtons from the golf committee just gave Julian $100,000 yesterday. Everyone is moving forward, making real money, and you are dragging your feet. It is embarrassing." I felt Elias stiffen beside me, his large hand gripping my waist a little tighter. "We aren't dragging our feet, Mom," I said, forcing a polite smile. "We're just being responsible." "You're being stubborn," my father, Dorian, interjected, appearing suddenly from the crowd with a fresh drink in his hand. He pointed a finger at me, his face flushed from the alcohol and the intoxicating illusion of his own elevated status. "Julian is offering you a lifeline to pull yourself out of mediocrity, and you're treating him like he's applying for a mortgage. You should be thanking him on your knees." I stared at my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, actively demanding that I hand over my life savings to a con artist. "We'll have the money wired by the end of next week, Julian," I said, directing my words solely to my brother-in-law to keep the trap perfectly baited. "I promise." Julian smiled, a slick, greasy expression of total victory. "Take your time, Isolde. I'm not going anywhere." We managed to survive the cocktail hour and the agonizingly long, boastful speeches during dinner. By the time the cake was cut, I had retreated to a quiet corner near the massive stone fireplace, sipping a glass of sparkling water, desperate for a moment of silence. But my mother was not finished with me. She had consumed 3 glasses of expensive champagne, and the alcohol had dissolved the thin, polite veneer she usually wore in public. She spotted me standing alone and marched over, a small group of her country club friends, wealthy, gossiping women covered in diamonds, trailing behind her like an audience. Selma stopped 2 feet away from me, her arms crossed tightly over her silver gown. "So," Selma began, her voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz music playing in the background, "I was just telling the girls about your grandmother's estate planning, since her health has been declining so rapidly." My chest tightened. My grandmother, my father's mother, Edith, was 82 and suffering from early-stage dementia. She lived in a modest, rustic farmhouse a few hours upstate. She was the only person in the Corbett family who had ever truly loved me. When my parents were busy parading Narina around at beauty pageants, I spent my summers on Edith's porch, drinking sweet tea and learning how to balance her checkbook. "What about Nana Edith?" I asked, my voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "Well," Selma sighed, putting on a highly theatrical face of maternal concern for her friends. "Her medical bills are going to become quite extensive. Dorian and I have decided that it is in the family's best interest to consolidate her assets. We are going to have Julian manage her estate. He can liquidate her farmhouse and put the cash into his high-yield fund to pay for her care. The air completely left my lungs. They were going to let Julian Vance liquidate my grandmother's home. They were going to feed Edith's entire life into the Ponzi scheme. "No," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop it. My voice was sharper, louder than I intended. "No, you cannot do that. Nana Edith loves that house. It's completely paid off. If she needs care, she can get in-home nursing. You cannot let Julian touch her property." The wealthy women surrounding my mother gasped slightly, offended by my sudden display of defiance. Selma's eyes narrowed into terrifying, hateful slits. She stepped directly into my personal space, completely discarding her public mask. "Excuse me?" Selma hissed, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated, narcissistic rage. "You do not get to dictate how this family operates, Isolde. You have done nothing but sit in the corner and judge us all night. You are so utterly selfish, so desperately jealous of your sister's perfect marriage and Julian's massive success that you are actively trying to sabotage your own grandmother's care. Mom, Julian is not..." "Shut your mouth," Selma snapped, her voice cracking like a whip across the quiet corner of the ballroom. Several guests turned their heads to stare at us. "I am sick and tired of your disrespect. You are a bitter, lonely disappointment. You contribute nothing to this family's legacy. Julian is a millionaire who is actively taking care of us, and you are nothing but a paper-pushing nobody." Elias appeared out of the crowd, his face dark as thunder. He stepped between my mother and me, his sheer physical presence forcing Selma to take a step back. "Do not speak to my wife like that," Elias warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute authority. Selma scoffed, looking Elias up and down with absolute disgust. "Oh, the heroic handyman steps in. You two deserve each other. You're both perfectly content to wallow in poverty." She turned her furious gaze back to me, playing her ultimate trump card in front of her high society audience. "If you do not wire that money to Julian by Monday morning, Isolde, and if you do not apologize to him right now in front of this entire room, I will have your father write you completely out of Edith's will. You will not see a single dime of her estate, and you will never set foot on her property again. Do you understand me?" It was the climax of 32 years of emotional abuse. It was the ultimate ultimatum. Bow down to the golden child and the con artist, or be permanently exiled from the only piece of family I actually cared about. 10 years ago, a threat like that would have broken me. I would have burst into tears, apologized profusely, and begged for her forgiveness just to keep the peace. But as I stood there in the glittering, pretentious ballroom, looking at the woman who had spent her entire life tearing me down, I felt an incredibly strange sensation wash over me. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel afraid. I felt absolutely, terrifyingly cold. I gently placed a hand on Elias's arm, stepping around him to look my mother dead in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I spoke with the icy, lethal precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "You are drowning in a glass of your own vanity, Mother," I said, my voice eerily calm, carrying clearly to the gossiping women standing behind her. "You are so desperate to appear wealthy to people who do not actually care about you that you are willing to sell your own mother-in-law's home to a man who wears a fake Rolex." Selma's mouth dropped open in pure, stunned shock. "Write me out of the will," I continued, my gaze never wavering. "Exile me. Do whatever you think you need to do to protect your fragile, pathetic little illusion. But when this entire house of cards comes crashing down, and it will come crashing down, do not you dare call me to save you." I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't look at my father, who was staring at me from across the room in horror, or at Narina, who was clutching Julian's arm. I reached out, took Elias's hand, and we walked perfectly in sync out of the grand ballroom, leaving the toxic, suffocating world of the Corbett family in our wake. The drive home was silent. Elias held my hand tightly across the center console, offering silent, unwavering support. The emotional adrenaline of the confrontation was slowly wearing off, replaced by a profound, heavy exhaustion. When we finally walked through the front door of our dark, quiet house, I didn't take off my coat. I walked straight to the kitchen island, opened my laptop, and entered the decryption password for my secure server. "Isolde, it's midnight," Elias said softly, coming up behind me and gently massaging my tense shoulders. "You just went to war with your mother. You need to rest. Let the software run. We can look at Julian's files tomorrow." "I can't sleep, Elias," I whispered, staring at the glowing screen. If they are planning to liquidate Nana Edith's house, I don't have weeks to build this case. I have days. I need to know exactly how much money Julian has stolen, and I need to know where it is right now. I opened the financial tracking software. The program had spent the last 48 hours crawling through the banking network, pulling the transactional metadata tied to the routing number Julian had so arrogantly emailed me. The dashboard loaded, displaying a massive, complex web of data points, line items, and color-coded wire transfers. I took a deep breath and began the forensic autopsy of Julian Vance's empire. The main account, the one registered to the dingy UPS store P.O. box, was the central hub. Just as I suspected, there was absolutely no evidence of high-frequency trading, offshore real estate purchases, or algorithm software payments. There were no incoming wires from legitimate prime brokerages or market clearinghouses. The only money entering the account were massive, devastating wire transfers from individual, unaccredited personal checking accounts. I clicked on the incoming ledger. My heart broke as I read the names. Susan Miller, $300,000, Aunt Susan's entire life savings. David Miller, $50,000, Uncle David's emergency medical fund. Thomas and Martha Harrington, $100,000. My parents' friends from the country club. Eleanor Vance, $75,000. Julian's own widowed mother. He wasn't just stealing from my family. He was robbing the elderly, the vulnerable, the people who trusted him completely. Then I shifted my focus to the outgoing ledger. This is where the Ponzi scheme truly revealed its ugly face. A massive chunk of the incoming cash was being immediately routed to a secondary shell account. From there, it was being hemorrhaged on purely depreciating luxury expenses. I saw a $4,000 monthly auto debit to BMW Financial Services. I saw repeated staggering charges to Neiman Marcus, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Cartier. I saw a $15,000 charge for the premium catering package at the Oak Ridge Country Club. He had literally used Aunt Susan's retirement money to buy my mother's birthday dinner. He was also paying out small, consistent dividend checks back to the original investors, using the new money coming in from people like the Harringtons to create the illusion of legitimate profit. It was a textbook, painfully unoriginal fraud. But as I scrolled further down the list of outgoing wire transfers, my eyes caught something strange, something that didn't fit the standard Ponzi pattern. Every single time a new, massive deposit hit Julian's account, a secondary automated wire transfer was triggered exactly 24 hours later. I looked at the math. When Aunt Susan wired her $300,000, exactly 24 hours later, an outgoing wire of $30,000 was sent to an external, unidentified checking account. When the Harringtons wired their $100,000, an outgoing wire of $10,000 was sent to that exact same external account. When Uncle David sent his $50,000, a wire of $5,000 went out, 10%. Julian was paying a flat 10% commission fee on every single dollar of new capital raised. In the financial world, this is called a finder's fee. It's a kickback paid to a broker who brings a new investor to a fund. Elias, I said, my voice suddenly trembling, the cold dread turning into a physical sickness in the pit of my stomach. Look at this. Elias leaned down, his eyes scanning the highlighted rows of data. 30 grand? 10 grand? Where is that money going, Isolde? He's paying a finder. Someone is actively recruiting these elderly victims for him, and he's paying them a 10% cut of the stolen money to keep the scheme alive. Who is the finder? Elias asked, his jaw tight. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I highlighted the routing and account number of the external receiving bank. I didn't need a subpoena to figure out who owned a basic domestic checking account. I just needed to run a reverse verification check through the federal banking portal I use for my corporate investigations. I pasted the account number into the portal. I hit enter. A small loading wheel spun in the center of the screen for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the official account registration details popped up in crisp black text. Account holder 1, Dorian Corbett. Account holder 2, Selma Corbett. The world completely stopped spinning. The hum of the refrigerator faded away. The sound of the rain against the window vanished. I stared at the 2 names on the screen, my brain violently rejecting the undeniable mathematical truth resting right in front of my eyes. Isolde, Elias whispered, stepping back from the screen, his face pale with absolute shock. Isolde, tell me, I'm not reading that right. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. My parents weren't victims. They weren't foolish, naive suburbanites who had been charmed by a slick con artist. They weren't just passively handing over their own money. They were active, willing, and fully complicit accomplices. My mother hadn't pressured Aunt Susan into investing out of a misguided sense of family loyalty. She pressured her because the moment Aunt Susan's $300,000 hit Julian's account, my mother and father were secretly wired a $30,000 kickback. They were using the country club, the dinner parties, and the fake aura of success to hunt for wealthy, vulnerable friends. They were leading lambs to the slaughter, handing them over to Julian, and taking a 10% cut of the stolen meat to fund their own pathetic, desperate need to look rich. They had sold out their own siblings. They had sold out their friends. And tonight, at the country club, my mother had gleefully announced her plan to hand over my sick, elderly grandmother's entire estate to Julian. If they liquidated Edith's farm for $1 million, my parents would pocket a cool $100,000 in stolen cash. They were planning to rob my grandmother blind while she was losing her memory. The ultimate betrayal wasn't Julian's fake Rolex or Narina's superficial greed. The ultimate betrayal was that the rot, the pure, unadulterated evil in this family started at the very top. My parents were thieves. A hot, stinging tear finally broke free, rolling down my cheek and dropping onto the keyboard. But it wasn't a tear of grief. It was the final, agonizing death of the little girl who had always hoped her parents would love her. Elias gently pulled my hands away from the keyboard. He turned me around in the chair and pulled me tightly into his arms. I buried my face in his chest, my body trembling with a mixture of profound heartbreak and a new, terrifyingly dark sense of purpose. "They're going to prison, Elias," I whispered against his shirt, the words tasting like ashen iron. "Julian, my mother, my father. I am going to send every single one of them to federal prison." Elias kissed the top of my head, his arms wrapping around me like a shield. "I know," he said softly. "I know you will. And I will help you burn it all down." The investigation was no longer just about exposing a fraud. It was a war. And the Corbett family had absolutely no idea the level of destruction I was about to unleash upon them. The call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the disastrous birthday party at the country club. The winter had settled over the city in a thick, gray sheet of ice. I was sitting at my desk, quietly compiling the final transaction ledgers of Julian's Ponzi scheme, when my phone vibrated. It was the nursing home facility where my grandmother, Edith, had been transferred after a severe bout of pneumonia. "Isolde," the head nurse said softly, her voice carrying the heavy, practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news for a living. "I am so sorry. Edith passed away peacefully in her sleep about an hour ago." I closed my eyes. The office around me, the ringing phones, the clacking keyboards, the low hum of corporate investigations completely vanished. A sharp physical ache bloomed in the center of my chest. Edith was gone. The woman who had taught me how to bake peach cobbler, who had bandaged my scraped knees when my mother was too busy picking out pageant dresses for Narina, who had quietly slipped money into my college fund because she knew my parents wouldn't pay a dime for my education. She was the only anchor tying me to the Corbett name, and now that anchor had slipped beneath the surface. I didn't cry in the office. I calmly thanked the nurse, packed my briefcase, and drove home. It wasn't until I walked through the front door and Elias wrapped his arms around me that the dam finally broke. I wept into his chest, mourning not just the loss of my grandmother, but the absolute final severing of my childhood. The funeral was held 4 days later. It was a bleak, freezing Friday. If you want to truly understand the pathology of a narcissistic family, watch how they behave at a funeral. A funeral is not about honoring the dead. It is a stage for the living to perform their grief. My mother, Selma, arrived at the quaint, historic chapel wearing a custom-tailored, stark black designer trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat with a dramatic veil. She looked like she was attending a casting call for a soap opera, rather than the burial of a woman she had openly despised for 3 decades. My father, Dorian, played the role of the stoic patriarch, accepting condolences from old family friends with a grave nod, discreetly checking his phone every 10 minutes. Narina and Julian arrived in a rented, blacked-out Lincoln Navigator. Narina wore oversized Chanel sunglasses inside the dimly lit chapel, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue. Julian used the solemn occasion to quietly network. I watched him from the back pew, my blood running cold as he handed a sleek black business card to one of Edith's elderly neighbors near the guest book. He was actively prospecting for new victims inches away from my grandmother's casket. I stood beside Elias, dressed in a simple, modest black dress, keeping my distance from the circus. I didn't engage, I just observed. I watched the people who had sold out their own family for a 10% kickback pretend to mourn. After the burial, custom dictated that the immediate family gather to discuss the estate. Edith's finances were simple. She didn't have millions in the bank, but she owned a beautiful, sprawling 40-acre farm upstate, completely free and clear of any mortgage. It was prime real estate, untouched by commercial developers. For years, Edith had explicitly and repeatedly told me that the farm would be mine. She knew my parents would sell it to the highest bidder to fund their lifestyle, and she wanted the property preserved. We gathered in the dining room of my parents' house, the exact same mahogany table where Julian had first pitched his fraudulent fund on Thanksgiving. The irony was suffocating. Elias and I sat on one side. Dorian, Selma, Narina, and Julian sat on the other, forming a united, predatory front. "Well," my father began, clearing his throat and unbuttoning his suit jacket, "this is a difficult day for all of us, but Mom wouldn't want us to sit around being morbid. She was a practical woman. We need to handle the logistics of her estate so we can all begin to heal." "Exactly," Selma chimed in, reaching into her expensive leather tote bag. She pulled out a thick, pristine manila folder and placed it squarely in the center of the table. She smoothed her hand over the top of it, a triumphant, glittering light dancing in her eyes. "As you know, Edith's cognitive decline over the past few months was tragic. It required Dorian and me to step in and take legal control to protect her assets." I felt Elias shift tensely beside me. "Legal control?" I asked, keeping my voice soft, laced with a calculated vulnerability. "Nana Edith told me she had a living will filed with her local attorney in the county." "Edith was confused, Isolde," Selma said, her tone dripping with fake maternal pity. "Dementia is a cruel disease. In her final weeks, she realized that she needed true financial professionals to handle her legacy, not a small-town lawyer. Dorian and I had her sign a comprehensive, durable power of attorney last month." My mother opened the folder. She slid a crisp white legal document across the polished wood toward me. "And using that power of attorney," Selma continued, her voice rising with arrogant confidence, "Dorian and I executed an updated, finalized last will and testament on Edith's behalf. It supersedes any old documents she might have mumbled about." I looked down at the paper. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my face remained an unreadable mask. "What does the new will dictate, Mom?" I asked. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, steepling his fingers together in a pathetic imitation of a corporate mastermind. "It dictates modernization, Isolde. The farm is a depreciating, illiquid asset. It costs money in property taxes and maintenance. So, as the legal executors, your parents have authorized the immediate transfer of the property deed into the Vance Capital Partners Holding Trust." Narina smiled, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Julian is going to list the farm for a commercial land developer next week. He already has a buyer lined up for $1.2 million in cash. The funds will be rolled directly into Julian's high-yield portfolio, generating a permanent, tax-free income stream for the family. It's exactly what Nana would have wanted. Generating a permanent income stream. No, it was generating a $120,000 finder's fee for my parents and $1 million cash injection into Julian's collapsing Ponzi scheme to keep the illusion alive for another 6 months. They were stealing a dead woman's home to fund their fraud." "I see," I whispered, acting as if the wind had been completely knocked out of me. I let my shoulders slump. I stared at the document, forcing a look of absolute, crushing defeat onto my face. Selma leaned back in her chair, practically vibrating with euphoric victory. She had done it. She had finally crushed the rebellious daughter, taken the inheritance, and secured her own wealth in one single, masterful stroke. "Don't look so sour, Isolde," Dorian said, trying to sound like a generous patriarch. "Julian is managing the trust. Once the farm is sold and the capital is compounding, we'll make sure you receive a small quarterly dividend. We take care of our own." "Can I look at it?" I asked, my voice trembling perfectly. "The new will and the power of attorney. I just want to see her signature." "Of course," Selma sneered, pushing the documents closer to me. "Read it and weep. It is ironclad, fully notarized and legally binding." I picked up the heavy, stapled packet of legal paper. To a normal person, a legal document is just a wall of intimidating text. But to a forensic investigator, a legal document is a crime scene. And narcissists are notoriously sloppy criminals. They believe they are so inherently superior that the rules simply do not apply to them. I scanned the durable power of attorney. There, at the bottom of the page, was my grandmother's signature. It was shaky, erratic, and completely unlike the elegant cursive she had used her entire life. They had likely guided her hand, or worse, traced it while she was heavily medicated in the nursing home. But a forged signature is hard to prove in court without a costly handwriting expert. I needed something absolute. I needed a mathematical, undeniable error. I moved my eyes down to the bottom right corner of the page. Notary Public Acknowledgement. There was a heavy blue ink stamp pressed onto the paper. It read, State Notary Public Commissioned, Robert J. Vance. Commission number 8849201. Expiration date, October 15th, 2027. Robert J. Vance, Julian's uncle, the man who had briefly sold real estate in the suburbs before retiring to Florida. I stared at the blue stamp. Julian and my parents hadn't hired an independent third-party notary to witness a woman with dementia signing away her estate, because an independent notary would have immediately flagged her lack of mental capacity and refused to stamp it. Instead, they had Julian's uncle do it as a favor. Or, more likely, Julian had simply kept his uncle's old physical notary stamp in a desk drawer and used it himself. My eyes locked onto the commission number and the expiration date. My brain automatically cataloged the 8-digit code. In my line of work, verifying the active status of a notary public is step 1 in authenticating corporate contracts. I let a single, well-timed tear slip down my cheek. I let it drop onto the mahogany table. Okay, I whispered, my voice breaking. I gently set the documents back down on the table, sliding them back toward my mother. You win, Mom. You took it. You took the only thing she wanted me to have. Selma's smile was blinding. She looked like she had just won an Oscar. It's not about winning or losing, Isolde. It's about securing the family's financial future. You should be grateful we have Julian to handle these complex matters. If we left it to you, that farm would just rot. Julian puffed out his chest, looking at Elias with a smug, victorious grin. Like I said, Elias, there are people who work for a living, and there are people who build empires. If you guys ever want to step up to the big leagues, my door is always open. Elias stood up slowly. He didn't yell. He didn't flip the table. He just looked at Dorian, Selma, Julian, and Narina with a look of such profound, chilling disgust that the smug smiles on their faces slightly faltered. Come on, Isolde, Elias said gently, extending his hand to me. We have nothing left to say to these people. We're leaving. I stood up, taking his hand. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. We walked out of my parents' house, the heavy front door clicking shut behind us. The moment we were inside our car, out of sight of the living room window, the fragile, heartbroken, defeated demeanor vanished from my body like smoke in the wind. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking, not from grief, but from pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Are you okay? Elias asked, putting the car into drive, glancing at me with deep concern. I know how much that farm meant to you. If you want to hire a lawyer and contest the will... I don't need a lawyer, Elias, I said, my voice sharp and razor-focused. I need the state registry portal. What did you see on that paper? He asked, sensing the immediate shift in my energy. They used Julian's uncle's notary stamp, I said, navigating my phone's browser to the Secretary of State's official Notary Public Verification database. Robert J. Vance, commission number 8849201. The stamp on the document says his commission expires in 2027. I typed the commission number into the database and hit search. The page loaded. Notary Public. Robert J. Vance. Status, revoked/deceased. Effective date of revocation, August 14th, 2023. I let out a breathless, echoing laugh that filled the small cabin of the car. It was a sound devoid of humor, laced with absolute terrifying triumph. What is it? Elias asked, his eyes wide. His uncle died 3 years ago, Elias, I whispered, staring at the screen. His notary commission was permanently revoked by the state upon his death. Elias slammed on the brakes as we reached a red light, turning to stare at me in pure shock. They used a dead man's stamp? They used a dead man's stamp, I confirmed, a dark, victorious smile spreading across my face. Julian probably found the physical stamp in his uncle's belongings after he passed away and kept it to rubber stamp his own fraudulent shell company documents. He used it on Edith's power of attorney. He stamped a date of 2026 using a commission that legally ceased to exist in 2023. Isolde, Elias breathed, realizing the sheer gravity of the mistake. Wire fraud and running a Ponzi scheme are severe financial crimes, I explained, the legal statutes scrolling through my mind like a ticker tape. But forging a federal legal document? Forging a power of attorney to steal $1 million estate from an elderly woman with dementia? That elevates this from a white-collar financial investigation into a massive, multi-count federal felony encompassing elder abuse, identity theft, and estate fraud. There is no fine for this. There is no probation. This carries a mandatory, multi-decade federal prison sentence. And your parents facilitated it, Elias said quietly, the reality of my parents' fate settling over the car. They presented the document. They claimed to be the executors. They are co-conspirators, I said coldly, locking my phone and dropping it into my purse. They wanted to play in the big leagues with Julian. Now they get to face the federal consequences with him. When we returned to our house, I didn't take off my coat. I walked straight into my home office and locked the door. I had spent the last month building a massive, undeniable digital dossier on the Ponzi scheme. I had the routing numbers, the shell accounts, the fake prospectuses, the luxury vehicle leases, and the damning kickback wires proving my parents were acting as unlicensed, fraudulent brokers. But this forged will was the final, lethal bullet in the chamber. I spent the next 12 hours compiling the greatest, most devastating forensic portfolio of my entire career. I didn't just summarize the crimes. I mapped them. I created visual flowcharts tracking Aunt Susan's retirement money directly into my parents' checking account and then into Narina's Neiman Marcus account. I printed the official state revocation record of the dead notary. I attached the SEC and FINRA database screenshots proving Julian's fund was a ghost. I packaged the entire investigation into 3 identical encrypted hard drives, accompanied by a 60-page, heavily cited executive summary printed on crisp, heavy stock paper. Narcissists like my mother and Julian rely on the chaos of emotion. They manipulate, they scream, they gaslight, and they twist the narrative until their victims are too exhausted to fight back. But you cannot gaslight a bank statement. You cannot manipulate a dead notary's federal record. You cannot scream at a routing number until it changes its mind. I bound the dossiers in thick, black leather folders. One copy was addressed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division in Manhattan. The second copy was addressed to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, because the only thing the federal government hates more than a thief is a thief who doesn't pay taxes on their stolen money. The third copy was for me. On Monday morning, before the sun had even risen, I drove to the main post office downtown. I paid for certified, signature required, priority overnight shipping for both federal packages. I handed the parcels to the postal worker. I watched them scan the barcodes. I watched the tracking numbers print out. "Would you like a receipt, ma'am?" the clerk asked politely. "Yes, please," I said, taking the small slip of paper. I walked out of the post office and stood on the freezing sidewalk, looking up at the gray winter sky. The trap was officially sprung. The timer had started. The federal gears were now grinding into motion, and there was absolutely no force on earth that could stop them. My parents thought they had won. They thought they had finally crushed me into submission, stolen my inheritance, and secured their lavish future. They were probably sitting in their country club right now, drinking champagne paid for by my Aunt Susan's stolen retirement, laughing at how easily they had manipulated the bitter, jealous daughter. They had absolutely no idea that a federal guillotine was currently suspended directly over their necks, and I had just pulled the lever. The fall of the Corbett Empire wasn't going to be a quiet, dignified affair. It was going to be a public, apocalyptic slaughter, and I was going to ensure I had a front row seat. 3 weeks later, the mid-January frost had turned the city into a brittle, frozen landscape. Inside my home office, however, the temperature was running hot. I was sitting at my desk when my encrypted work cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed a blocked, unlisted number. "Isolde Thorne?" a deep professional voice asked. "Speaking," I replied, setting my pen down. "This is Special Agent Reynolds, Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division, Manhattan Field Office. I'm calling regarding a 60-page forensic dossier we received via certified mail." A cold electric thrill shot straight down my spine. "I've been expecting your call, Agent Reynolds." "Mrs. Thorne, I've been with the Bureau for 15 years, Reynolds said, the rustling of heavy paper audible through the receiver. "And I have to say, this is the most comprehensive, bulletproof civilian referral I have ever seen in my career. You mapped the shell accounts, provided the routing numbers, and cross-referenced the state notary logs for the forged power of attorney. You essentially handed us a fully baked federal indictment with a bow on top." "I am a senior forensic accountant, Agent Reynolds. I take my work very seriously." "Clearly," he chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "We've corroborated your findings. We executed a silent subpoena on the primary bank account registered to the UPS store. The funds are exactly where you said they were, and the kickbacks to Dorian and Selma Corbett have been verified. We also pulled the death certificate for Robert J. Vance. The notary stamp is a confirmed forgery." "So, what is the next step?" I asked, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. "Warrants," Reynolds stated flatly. "A federal judge signed off on them an hour ago. We are moving in to freeze the accounts and apprehend the targets. However, we have a tactical issue. Julian Vance does not have a registered corporate office, and his home address is a luxury high-rise with heavy security. We prefer to execute these arrests in an environment where we can simultaneously secure physical evidence, like his mobile devices and laptops, before he has a chance to wipe them." I leaned back in my chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. Narcissists are creatures of habit. They cannot resist an audience, and they cannot resist a stage. "You don't need to raid his apartment, Agent Reynolds," I said smoothly. "Tonight is the Oak Ridge Country Club's annual Winter Investment Gala. Julian Vance is the keynote speaker. He is currently courting a retired shipping magnate named Arthur Sterling, attempting to secure a $5 million cash injection into the fund. My parents, Dorian and Selma, are the hosts of the event. They will all be in the main ballroom." There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the sharp scratch of a pen as Reynolds took notes. "A public country club gala," Reynolds mused, his voice laced with absolute professional satisfaction. "Excellent. We will coordinate with the SEC and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Thank you for your cooperation, Mrs. Thorne. We strongly advise you to stay clear of the premises tonight." "With all due respect, Agent Reynolds," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper of pure, hardened steel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." That evening, Elias and I dressed for war. I didn't wear a modest, fading dress to blend into the background. I wore a tailored, floor-length midnight blue gown that fit like a second skin. It was sleek, professional, and radiated absolute, untouchable power. I pinned my hair back into a sharp, elegant twist. Elias wore a perfectly fitted charcoal suit, his broad shoulders and quiet confidence making him look like a bodyguard straight out of a movie. When we pulled up to the Oak Ridge Country Club, the massive Tudor-style building was glowing with golden light. The valet took our keys and we walked up the grand stone steps. The main ballroom was a testament to the absolute peak of my mother's pathetic, fragile ego. There were towering centerpieces of white winter roses, crystal champagne towers, and a live string quartet playing in the corner. The room was packed with the wealthiest, most influential, and most gullible elderly residents of our city. Julian Vance was in his element. He was standing near the grand fireplace, holding a snifter of expensive brandy, surrounded by a tight circle of fascinated investors. Narina was clinging to his arm, wearing a spectacular, obviously brand new diamond necklace that easily cost $50,000, paid for, undoubtedly, by the recent liquidation of some poor retiree's 401k. My parents were working the perimeter. Dorian was aggressively shaking hands and patting backs, while Selma floated through the crowd, pointing out Julian to her friends like he was a prize-winning racehorse. We stepped into the ballroom. It took exactly 30 seconds for my mother's radar to lock onto me. Selma broke away from a group of women and marched directly toward us. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing as she took in my tailored gown and Elias's sharp suit. She had expected me to show up in rags, broken and begging for a slice of my grandmother's stolen estate. She did not expect me to look like I owned the building. "Isolde," Selma hissed, stopping 2 feet away, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "What are you doing here? This is a private, high-net-worth event. You are not on the guest list." "I am a member of the family, Mom. I said, offering her a chilling, perfectly empty smile. I came to hear Julian's big speech. I wouldn't miss it. You came to cause a scene, she sneered, crossing her arms. You came because you realized you made a massive mistake walking away from Edith's estate, and now you want to grovel. Well, it is too late. Julian finalized the listing for the farm yesterday. The money is going straight into the trust. You get nothing. We'll see about that, I replied softly. Before Selma could launch into another tirade, the sharp clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal microphone echoed through the ballroom. Julian Vance was standing on the raised mahogany stage at the front of the room. He adjusted his velvet lapels, waiting for the wealthy crowd to quiet down. My mother instantly abandoned me, practically running to the front row to gaze up at her golden son-in-law. Elias and I remained in the back, leaning casually against a stone pillar. I reached into my sleek evening clutch and pulled out 2 crisp black leather folders. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed friends, and future partners, Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with fake practice charisma. Welcome to the Vance Capital Winter Gala. As I look around this magnificent room, I don't just see investors. I see family. The crowd offered a polite, murmuring applause. Arthur Sterling, the retired shipping magnate, was sitting at a VIP table directly in front of the stage, nodding approvingly. We are living in volatile times, Julian continued, pacing the stage like a Silicon Valley visionary. Inflation is eating your savings. Traditional banks are offering you fractions of a penny. But at Vance Capital, we don't play by the traditional rules. We use proprietary, institutional-grade algorithms to guarantee, yes, guarantee, double-digit yields for our private partners. In fact, we just secured a massive $1 million real estate acquisition this very week that is going to hypercharge our first quarter dividends. He was bragging about stealing my grandmother's house on a hot microphone. The absolute staggering arrogance of it made my blood run cold. So, to those of you who have already joined the Vance family, congratulations, Julian smiled, raising his glass. And to those of you considering making the leap tonight, I promise you, it will be the most lucrative decision of your entire life. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. I didn't clap. I simply pushed off the stone pillar and began walking through the sea of clapping hands. Elias walked 2 steps behind me, a silent, immovable shadow. I walked directly to the front VIP table where Arthur Sterling was sitting with his wife. I placed one of the heavy, black leather folders squarely on top of his pristine white dinner plate. Then I walked over to the neighboring table where Thomas and Martha Harrington, the couple my parents had manipulated into investing $100,000, were sitting. I placed the second black folder in front of them. Julian paused, the microphone lowering slightly from his mouth as he watched me. His confident smile faltered. My mother, standing just a few feet away, glared at me with absolute fury. Isolde, what are you doing? Selma snapped loudly, grabbing my arm. Stop handing out your pathetic little accounting resumes. You are embarrassing me. I smoothly pulled my arm out of her grip. I looked at Arthur Sterling, who was staring at the black folder in confusion. Open it, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the fading applause. Arthur Sterling frowned, his thick white eyebrows knitting together. He opened the leather folder. The first page was the executive summary, printed on official federal complaint letterhead, displaying a massive, highly detailed flowchart. What is this? Sterling mumbled, pulling out his reading glasses. That is a forensic audit, I announced, raising my voice just enough so the front half of the ballroom could hear me perfectly. It details exactly where Vance Capital Partners keeps its money. Turn to page 4, Mr. Sterling. You will see that Julian does not own an algorithm. He does not own a prime brokerage. And he does not have a license to trade securities. The ballroom went completely, suffocatingly silent. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Julian's face drained of all color. He looked like he had just been struck by lightning. He gripped the microphone stand so hard his knuckles turned white. Security! Julian shouted, his voice cracking with sudden, violent panic. Get her out of here. She's a disgruntled, psychotic relative. She's lying. Turn to page 6, Martha, I said, turning my attention to Mrs. Harrington, ignoring Julian completely. Martha Harrington, trembling slightly, flipped the page in her folder. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That is a ledger of your $100,000 wire transfer, I explained, my words cutting through the tense air like a scalpel. If you look closely, you will see that the very next day, a $10,000 kickback was wired directly into the personal checking account of Dorian and Selma Corbett. My parents didn't introduce you to Julian because they are your friends, Martha. They introduced you to him because they were being paid a 10% bounty to hunt you. Chaos erupted. Thomas Harrington shot up from his chair, his face purple with rage, turning to glare at my father. Dorian stepped backward, his hands raised defensively, stammering incoherently. "It's a lie!" Selma shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. She lunged toward Martha's table, desperately trying to snatch the black folder away. "She faked those documents. Isolde is a jealous, pathological liar." "Turn to page 12, I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. "That is the paper trail of Aunt Susan's retirement fund being used to pay the lease on Julian's BMW and the $50,000 diamond necklace currently resting on my sister Narina's neck." Narina gasped, instinctively clutching the diamonds at her throat, looking around the room like a cornered animal. Julian dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a deafening, high-pitched screech of feedback. He didn't try to defend himself anymore. He didn't try to explain the algorithm. He just turned and bolted toward the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the stage, desperate to find the kitchen exit. But he didn't even make it 3 steps. Suddenly, the massive oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom were thrown violently open. The freezing night air rushed into the room, accompanied by the blinding, strobing flash of red and blue police lights reflecting off the country club windows. A dozen men and women in dark suits and heavy tactical windbreakers swarmed into the grand ballroom. The gold letters FBI and IRSCI were emblazoned across their backs. "Federal agents! Nobody move!" a booming voice commanded. The wealthy guests screamed. Women dropped their champagne glasses. They shattered against the marble floor. Elderly men scrambled out of the way, pressing themselves against the walls in absolute terror. Special Agent Reynolds, a tall, imposing man with graying hair and a badge hanging from his neck, marched directly down the center aisle of the ballroom. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly at the stage. 2 younger, heavily built agents bypassed the stairs, vaulted directly onto the mahogany stage, and tackled Julian Vance just as he reached the velvet curtain. Julian hit the floor hard, letting out a pathetic, breathless yelp. "Julian Vance!" Reynolds announced, his voice carrying the terrifying weight of the United States federal government. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. Put your hands behind your back." The metallic click-clack of heavy steel handcuffs locking around Julian's wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. It was the sound of an entire fake empire permanently crashing to the ground. Narina stood frozen in the front row, staring at her husband being hauled up from the floor by his collar. The reality of the situation finally pierced through her thick, delusional bubble of entitlement. The money was gone. The illusion was dead. And she was standing in the middle of a federal raid wearing stolen diamonds. Narina immediately burst into hysterical, theatrical tears. She dropped to her knees, burying her face in her hands, playing the ultimate victim. "I didn't know," Narina sobbed loudly, making sure the federal agents could hear her over the commotion. "I swear I didn't know. He lied to me. He told me he was a millionaire. I'm just an innocent wife. He manipulated me just like he manipulated everyone else." Julian, who was being marched toward the edge of the stage by the 2 agents, stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down at his beautiful, weeping wife, the woman he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars to please, the woman who was currently throwing him straight to the wolves without a single second of hesitation to save her own skin. The cowardice and arrogance in Julian vanished, replaced by a cold, spiteful, absolutely venomous fury. "You lying, greedy bitch!" Julian screamed at the top of his lungs, fighting against the agent's grip to glare down at Narina. "You think I'm doing 20 years in federal lockup while you play the innocent victim and keep the jewelry?" Narina stopped fake crying. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with sudden, genuine panic. Julian turned his head to look directly at Special Agent Reynolds. "Check her phone!" Julian yelled, his face red, spitting as he spoke. "Check her iMessages. She knew every single damn thing. Last month, when the accounts were running dry, she literally texted me and told me to, and I quote, drain Mrs. Gable's emergency fund so I can buy the Cartier watch before the gala. She is my partner. She picked the targets." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the ballroom. Narina scrambled backward on the floor, her expensive gown twisting around her legs. "He's lying. He's just trying to drag me down with him." Agent Reynolds didn't blink. He casually gestured to a female IRS agent standing nearby. "Seize her mobile device and bag the jewelry. She's officially a co-conspirator." "No!" Narina shrieked as the female agent approached her, roughly confiscating her designer clutch and ordering her to unhook the stolen $50,000 diamond necklace. Narina fought, thrashing and weeping, completely stripped of her golden child dignity, reduced to a common, hysterical thief. But the federal agents were not finished. Agent Reynolds pulled a second set of folded warrants from his inner jacket pocket. He slowly turned his gaze away from the stage, his eyes scanning the terrified crowd until they locked directly onto my parents. Selma was hyperventilating, leaning heavily against my father, who looked like he was about to suffer a massive cardiac event. Dorian's face was the color of wet ash. "Dorian and Selma Corbett," Reynolds announced, stepping toward them. "Wait, please," Selma begged, her voice cracking, her hands trembling violently as she held them up in surrender. "We are victims. Julian stole from us too. He tricked us." "Save it for the judge, Mrs. Corbett," Reynolds said coldly. "We have the bank records of your 10% kickbacks. You actively recruited victims into a known Ponzi scheme." Reynolds took another step forward, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register that ensured every single one of their wealthy country club friends heard every word. "Furthermore, we have a federal warrant for your arrest regarding the fraudulent execution of a durable power of attorney and a last will and testament across state lines, utilizing the forged stamp of a deceased notary public. You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse and federal estate fraud." My father didn't run. He just collapsed into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping openly. The proud, stoic patriarch who had belittled my career was sobbing like a child in the middle of a country club. But my mother refused to accept reality. Her narcissistic brain simply could not process the fact that she had lost. As an agent grabbed Selma's arm to pull her hands behind her back, she fought wildly, twisting around to look desperately for a scapegoat. Her wild, manic eyes locked onto me. I was standing perfectly still next to Elias, watching the entire scene with an expression of some pure, hollow indifference. "You did this!" And Selma screamed, her face contorting into a mask of absolute hatred, spit flying from her lips as the agent forced the steel handcuffs onto her wrists. "You ruined this family! You set us up because you couldn't stand to see us happy! You are a monster, Isolde! You are a monster!" I didn't yell back. I didn't defend myself. I just looked at the woman who had spent 32 years trying to break my spirit. "I didn't forge the notary stamp, Mom," I said softly, my voice carrying just enough to reach her ears over the chaos. "I didn't steal Aunt Susan's retirement. You built this cage with your own 2 hands. I just locked the door." The agents aggressively marched Selma, Dorian, Julian, and Narina straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. The wealthy guests, the very people my parents had spent their entire lives trying to impress, parted like the Red Sea, staring at them with absolute, unadulterated disgust. The Grand Oak Ridge Country Club, the temple of my mother's vanity, had become the site of her ultimate, permanent destruction. As the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the federal agents, taking the toxic, rotting core of the Corbett family out into the freezing night, the ballroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. I looked down at the black leather folder resting on Arthur Sterling's table. The truth was out. The money would be traced, and while not all of it could be recovered, the bleeding had officially stopped. Aunt Susan and Uncle David would find out the truth tomorrow. It would break their hearts, but they were safe from further ruin. Elias gently placed his hand on the small of my back. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked quietly. I looked around the room one last time. I felt no regret. I felt no sorrow. For the first time in my entire life, I felt completely, undeniably free. "Yes," I whispered, leaning into his warmth. "Let's go home." The fallout from the Oak Ridge Country Club raid was absolute, swift, and spectacularly public. When the federal government builds a white-collar criminal case, they do not move until the walls are already closing in. Within 48 hours, the local news cycle was completely dominated by the collapse of Vance Capital Partners. The headlines were brutal, exposing the fake private equity fund, the stolen retirement accounts, and the shocking involvement of a prominent local family who had acted as predatory brokers. Julian Vance was denied bail. The federal judge took one look at the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence I had provided, factored in the offshore shell accounts Julian had attempted to set up, and declared him an extreme flight risk. The man who had worn velvet dinner jackets and fake Rolexes was now sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell, wearing a standard issue orange jumpsuit. Narina's reality shattered in a matter of days. The authorities froze every single one of her bank accounts and seized her leased BMW, her designer wardrobe, and her jewelry. Stripped of her stolen wealth and completely abandoned by her high society friends, who now treated her like a highly contagious disease, the golden child was forced to face the real world with no college degree, zero marketable skills, and a name heavily associated with a publicized federal felony. Last I heard, she was renting a room in a dingy motel on the outskirts of town, working as a minimum wage cashier at a discount retail store, scanning cheap merchandise just to afford her groceries. But the most satisfying collapse belonged to my parents. Dorian and Selma Corbett were indicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud and the interstate forgery of legal estate documents. They were out on bail, but their lives were effectively over. The country club officially revoked their membership via a cold 2-sentence email. Their friends blocked their numbers. They were trapped inside their suburban home, drowning in legal debt, turning their toxic venom entirely upon each other as they waited for their inevitable trial. In the midst of this catastrophic wreckage, the probate court finally intervened to settle my grandmother's estate. Because the durable power of attorney and the revised last will and testament had been proven as federal forgeries, the judge immediately threw them out. The court reverted to the only legally sound, properly filed document on record, Edith's original, authentic will, drafted 10 years ago by her trusted small-town attorney. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Elias and I sat in the polished, wood-paneled office of the probate judge. The opposing side of the table was empty. My parents were legally barred from attending, their status as executors permanently stripped. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her reading glasses and unsealed the heavy manila envelope containing my grandmother's true wishes. "The estate is straightforward, Mrs. Thorne," the judge said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "Your grandmother, Edith Corbett, has left her entire liquid savings, a modest sum of $20,000, to be divided among several local animal shelters. However, the entirety of her physical assets, specifically the 40-acre farm and the residential structure residing on it, has been left exclusively to you." I smiled softly, feeling a warm, comforting wave of peace wash over me. Edith had kept her promise. The farm was safe. "It's a beautiful piece of property," Elias murmured, squeezing my hand. "We can finally fix up the porch like she always wanted." The judge cleared her throat, flipping to the second page of the file. She looked up at me, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Mrs. Thorne," the judge continued, "are you aware of the current zoning and infrastructure developments occurring in that specific county?" I frowned, leaning forward. "No, Your Honor. My mother always called it a useless, depreciating hayfield. I just assumed it was standard agricultural zoning." "Your mother was wildly misinformed," the judge stated, sliding a thick official county surveyor's map across the desk. 3 years ago, the federal government approved the expansion of the interstate highway system. The new commercial bypass is scheduled to cut directly through the southern perimeter of Edith's 40 acres. My forensic brain instantly kicked into gear. I stared at the red lines drawn across the map. An interstate bypass meant commercial zoning. It meant gas stations, logistics hubs, and massive corporate development. Edith was heavily courted by commercial real estate developers for the last 2 years of her life, the judge explained, tapping the map with her pen. She refused to sell because she knew if she liquidated the land while she was alive, your parents would find a way to bleed the cash out of her. She kept the highway project an absolute secret from them. "How much is it worth?" Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper, realizing the sheer magnitude of what the judge was implying. The judge pulled out an official appraisal document dated from the previous month. "The state has already offered a mandatory buyout for the highway easement," the judge said cleanly, "combined with the commercial rezoning value of the remaining acreage. The property is currently appraised at exactly $12.5 million, and as of this morning, Mrs. Thorne, you are the sole legal owner of that entire fortune." I sat back in my leather chair, completely stunned. $12.5 million. My mother and my sister had spent their entire lives obsessing over the illusion of wealth. They had destroyed their family, betrayed their friends, and committed federal felonies just to pretend they had money. Selma had risked a multi-decade prison sentence to forge documents for a wooden farmhouse she thought was worth a measly $1 million, completely oblivious to the fact that a massive, generational fortune was sitting quietly in the dirt waiting for me. Their blinding, arrogant greed had been their ultimate undoing. Their desperate attempt to ruin me and steal my inheritance had only propelled me toward a level of success they could never even dream of. 2 weeks later, I received a formal request from the Federal Detention Center. Selma's bail had been revoked after she attempted to contact a witness, and she was currently sitting in a holding facility awaiting her trial date. She wanted to see me. Elias offered to go with me, to stand by my side and protect me from whatever toxic venom she had left to spit. But I shook my head. This was a battle I needed to finish alone. The Federal Detention Center was a bleak, monolithic concrete building that smelled heavily of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and profound despair. It was the absolute antithesis of the Oak Ridge Country Club. I was escorted into a sterile, brightly lit visitation room divided by a thick pane of bulletproof plexiglass. I sat down in the cold metal chair wearing a sharp, tailored beige trench coat, my hair perfectly styled, radiating an aura of absolute, unbothered calm. A heavy steel door on the opposite side of the room buzzed open. A prison guard escorted my mother into the booth. I almost didn't recognize her. The glamorous, terrifying matriarch of the Corbett family was completely gone. Selma was wearing a faded, oversized gray jumpsuit. Her face was entirely devoid of the expensive makeup she used to hide her insecurities. Her hair, usually perfectly dyed and styled into a voluminous blowout, was flat, graying at the roots, and tied back in a messy knot. The deep, dark circles under her eyes made her look 20 years older. She sat down heavily in the metal chair across from me, picking up the black plastic telephone receiver. Her hands were shaking. I picked up my receiver, holding it to my ear. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her. "Isolde," Selma whispered, her voice cracking. It wasn't the sharp, commanding bark I was used to. It was a pathetic, whimpering rasp. "Hello, Selma," I replied, my voice perfectly level. She flinched at the use of her first name. She pressed her free hand against the plexiglass, her eyes welling up with tears. "Please," she sobbed, the tears spilling over her pale, lined cheeks. "Please, Isolde. You have to help me. You have to talk to the FBI. Tell them it was all Julian. Tell them Dorian and I were just stupid, that we didn't understand the paperwork. We were manipulated. I can't survive in here. The food is disgusting. The bed is hard. They treat me like an animal." "You forged a federal document to steal a dying woman's home," I stated calmly, completely immune to her theatrical tears. "You recruited your own brother into a Ponzi scheme so you could buy designer clothes. The FBI doesn't care if you were manipulated, Selma. They only care about the paper trail. And your paper trail is a highway to a federal penitentiary." Selma squeezed her eyes shut, a desperate guttural sob escaping her throat. "We don't have any money left, Isolde. The government froze our accounts. Dorian's public defender is an idiot who just wants us to plead guilty. We need a real defense attorney. We need a high-powered shark." She opened her eyes, looking at me with a sudden, desperate flare of the old, greedy entitlement I knew so well. "The farm," Selma said, her breath fogging the plexiglass. "The probate court gave you Edith's farm. Norina told me before my bail was revoked. You have it. You can sell it. Even if it's only worth $1 million, you can take out a loan against the deed. You can hire us a legal team. You have to do this for us, Isolde. We are your parents. You owe us." I stared at her. The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She was sitting in a prison cell for trying to steal my property, and her master plan was to beg me to sell that exact same property to save her. I reached into my designer leather handbag. I pulled out a crisp white envelope and slid it through the narrow metal transaction slot at the bottom of the plexiglass. Selma eagerly snatched it up, her hands trembling as she tore the envelope open. She fully expected to find a cashier's check or the business card of a $500 an hour defense attorney. Instead, she pulled out a single, heavily itemized sheet of paper. Her brow furrowed in confusion as she read the bold text at the top of the page. "What is this?" Selma asked, her voice dropping to a confused whisper. This is a student loan statement." "That is correct," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that sent a visible shiver down her spine. 12 years ago, when I was 20 years old and working 2 part-time jobs to put myself through night school, you needed $50,000 in cash to throw Norina's first, lavish, ridiculous wedding. You didn't have the money. So, you secretly used my social security number to take out a massive private student loan in my name." Selma's face went completely, deathly white. The memory of her ultimate silent betrayal hit her like a physical blow. "When I found out," I continued, savoring every single word, "you cried. You manipulated me. You told me it was a mistake, a clerical error, and that if I reported it as fraud, the police would arrest my own mother. You begged me to just take over the payments to keep the family together. You used my empathy as a weapon against me. Isolde, that was a long time ago, she stammered, the paper shaking violently in her hand. We made sacrifices for this family. I spent my entire 20s eating ramen noodles and living in a tiny, freezing apartment just to pay off the suffocating debt you forced onto my shoulders, I said, my voice rising just enough to command the entire room. I paid for your golden child's wedding while you treated me like dirt. I pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured finger at the piece of paper in her trembling hands. That document is an itemized bill, I stated with absolute terrifying finality. It covers the original $50,000 you stole from me, plus 12 years of aggressively accrued compound interest. It also includes the expensive legal fees I incurred this week while moving Edith's $12.5 million estate into an ironclad, untouchable corporate trust fund that you will never, ever have access to. Selma gasped, dropping the paper onto the metal counter as if it had physically burned her fingers. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. 12 million? You have 30 days to pay that balance in full, Selma, I said coldly. If you do not, my legal team will file civil identity theft and fraud charges against you, stacking an entirely new layer of state felonies on top of your federal indictment. Selma couldn't breathe. She was hyperventilating, staring at the bill, the staggering realization of her total defeat finally crushing the last remaining ounce of her narcissistic pride. She had traded a $12 million empire for a fake Rolex and a prison jumpsuit. You can't do this to me, Selma wept, sliding out of her chair, her knees hitting the concrete floor of the visitation booth. She pressed her face against the plexiglass, begging me like a broken child. Please, Isolde, I'm your mother. I am your mother. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my beige trench coat. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the concrete and I felt nothing. Not an ounce of pity, not an ounce of anger. Just pure, absolute liberation. That is the final bill of the Corbett family, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the plastic receiver. From this moment on, legally and by blood, I no longer have a mother. I hung the heavy black receiver on the hook. The sharp click severed the connection permanently. I didn't wait to watch her reaction. I didn't look back as she screamed my name behind the soundproof glass. I turned around, pushed open the heavy steel door of the visitation room, and walked out into the bright, crisp winter sunlight. Elias was waiting for me by our car in the parking lot. He saw the expression on my face, the lightness in my steps, the absolute peace radiating from my chest. He smiled, opening the passenger door for me. We didn't just drive away from the federal prison. We drove away from my past forever. Exactly 1 year later, the world outside was blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of white snow. Elias and I were sitting in the newly renovated, sprawling glass-enclosed office of our downtown high-rise. The brass plaque on the heavy oak doors read, "The Edith Corbett Financial Advocacy Foundation." I didn't use my grandmother's multi-million-dollar inheritance to buy designer clothes or fake luxury cars. I used it to build a fortress. I established an elite legal and financial advocacy center dedicated entirely to helping women escape domestic and familial financial abuse. We hired top-tier forensic accountants and ruthless defense attorneys to help victims untangle themselves from narcissistic parents, abusive spouses, and hidden corporate debts. We dismantled the exact kind of control my parents had tried to use on me. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city skyline, holding a warm mug of coffee. Elias came up behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist, resting his chin softly on my shoulder. The foundation just secured the legal release for that young mother in Brooklyn, Elias murmured, kissing my cheek. She got her entire stolen savings back. You saved her life, Isolde. I leaned back into his embrace, a deep, profound sense of joy washing over me. We had built a chosen family, a family based on mutual respect, genuine love, and absolute honesty. There was no toxic hierarchy here. No one was demanding money, no one was wearing stolen diamonds, and no one was shrinking themselves down to make a golden child feel tall. I realized in that quiet, beautiful moment that the greatest revenge I could have ever achieved wasn't exposing my mother's crimes or sending my brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary. The ultimate revenge was simply moving on. It was healing. It was building a beautiful, untouchable life filled with purpose, wealth, and genuine love. A life that the Corbett family would never, ever be allowed to enter. I took a deep breath, watching the snow fall over the city, and smiled. I was finally home, and I was completely, undeniably free. Thank you so much for listening to the Corbett's White Veil. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to walk away from toxic people to protect your own peace, please let me know in the comments below. You are not alone, and your healing is the greatest victory you can ever achieve. Don't forget to hit that like button, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice, karma, and finding your own power. Until next time, stay strong, stay sharp, and always trust your instincts.